Good morning, everyone, and happy Employee Ownership Day. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. Whether you're part of an employer business, an advisor, someone exploring whether employee ownership might be for your business, or someone curious about the impact and why employee ownership matters, I hope you find the time today to share a thought about employee ownership on social media in order to celebrate Employee Ownership Day with us. I want to thank our friends at Baxendale, who are specialist advisors in employee ownership, for sponsoring this year's celebrations. EO Day was created in 2013 to celebrate employee ownership and to raise awareness of its impact on individuals, on businesses, and on the wider economy. So this year, the campaign is centred on identifying why EO is the answer. And by the look of all the hundreds of tweets I've seen this morning, there's certainly lots of reasons being identified. In its 8th year, the need to raise awareness of employee ownership is still as relevant, although, as we will hear later, the sector has grown significantly in that time. However, this year is an important year to be not only recognising the impact of employee ownership, but to explore the further opportunities for more employee ownership too. As we start to emerge from the health crisis of COVID-19 and face into a likely economic crisis, there are some profound questions to answer about the future of the UK economy. How can we ensure in future that we have higher levels of personal and corporate financial resilience? How can we rebuild the economy so that every employee is fairly rewarded in secure employment, so that we can reduce levels of wealth and income inequality? How do we help to protect the UK's SME base, where 60% of private sector employment resides and over half of private sector turnover? How do we ensure that each region across the UK is more sustainable, rooting jobs for local workforces, investing in the unique attributes of its place and creating more long-term prosperity? And how do we ensure that in addressing the survival of businesses, we don't ignore the need at the same time to improve levels of productivity? We know that employee ownership works because every employee has both a stake and a say in the place they work. Through more inclusive governance and effective engagement, employees are united behind a common purpose. They exert more discretional effort, which in then turns drives higher corporate performance, and subsequently each employee benefits from a fairer share in the proceeds of success. So today is about answering some of those questions, and we'll be discussing those later with a panel of colleagues from the EO community. I'm also delighted that we will have a view from the wider economy, as we're also joined by Dan Thomas of the Financial Times. Before that, we'll be revealing the latest statistics from the sector. That's always an exciting time as we see how the sector has changed shape and how it's grown. So sit back for the next hour. I hope you've got a cup of coffee ready. If you've got any questions, please use the facility at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A facility, and we will try to handle as many questions as we possibly can. But before then, I want to introduce our sponsor of EO Day 2020, Baxendale. Long-term supporters and partners of the EOA, Baxendale are specialist advisors to the EO sector, and I'm delighted therefore to welcome Ewan Hall to say a few words.
Thanks, Deb. For those of you who don't know, Baxendale is part of the Baxi Partnership Group, and we've been employee-owned for almost 40 years and indeed helped found the Employee Ownership Association many decades ago. And our support for the sector continues undiminished to this day. So we're employee-owned ourselves, and for the last 20 years, we've been helping support other businesses on their journey to employee ownership. And we provide support in many ways: technical, legal, tax, but also advice and guidance about setting up a positive employee culture and the other aspects of employee ownership. These are uniquely challenging times, and this is in many ways the perfect storm for a lot of employee ownership trusts to be put under a lot of pressure in terms of how's our business that we own doing, but also how are the beneficiaries of our trust doing in these challenging times. And we found that Almost without exception, the businesses and organizations we work with have responded incredibly to this challenging pandemic that we've all been wrestling with, including ourselves as an employee-owned business. And it just reinforces the fact that this is a business model that really works for businesses in the good times and the challenging times. And as part of that, for EO Day this year, we've actually launched a new tool on our website, a new succession planning tool, which helps guide people through their priorities for succession and what they might be thinking about when thinking about succession, while also giving them some detailed feedback and a report on how they might take that succession plan forward, including things like evaluation, etc., of their business. But I'm really interested in seeing how the conversation today goes, and hopefully we can contribute in some meaningful way as well. Many thanks.
Thanks, Ewan. And once again, thank you to you and the team for sponsoring this year's EO Day. So I'm absolutely delighted now to introduce two people who I'm sure many of you may know already. This is Professor Andrew Robinson and Nigel Mason. So Andrew and Nigel have been collaborating for many years now on the production of the statistics which help scale the sector. They're very valuable to the EOA. They help us talk about the sector in a much more informed way. So Andrew, Nigel, if you'd like to join me, and delighted to have you both here. Good morning. And you're going to share with us some information about the sector's growth. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I think Nigel and myself are going to do a double act in terms of this. We're going to look at different elements of the sector. So if you could have the first slide, Annabelle, please. I'm going to probably look at the broad picture. And in part of sort of the double act, Nigel's going to look more specifically at some of the subsample, the larger firms, and EOTs. So I have a sort of history of doing sort of work in this area with my colleague Andrew Pendleton. We've been working on this area for about 30 years, but over the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years, we've been collecting data in collaboration with the EOA, trying to track the growth of the sector, and we're trying to provide some sort of empirical backbone to the growth of the sector and what it's doing. It might look quite easy work, and I keep thinking that, but that's actually why I've got no hair and it's totally grey. It's actually a very difficult task in trying to identify firms. I like to look at employee ownership as a varieties of employee ownership. There's lots of different models out there. And probably what I'm trying to do, which is distinctive from Nigel, is look at all the different forms. So we're looking at direct, we're looking at hybrid, we're looking at indirect forms, and trying to gauge those. And how we do that is by looking at publicly available information. That will be information at Companies House, that could be your web pages, it could be internet searches, anything in the media, any form that we can find. We're trying to identify employee-owned firms. So we've been doing this for a long time. We're trying to cross-validate all the time. So we're not trying to just take one source, we're trying to take multiple sources so that hopefully we can come up with I think a conservative estimate. And these are the ones that we can identify. But Andrew and myself have been doing this for a number of years. So we're fairly skilled in doing this. The common denominator that we're looking for, whatever the form of direct, hybrid or indirect, is that there is at least 25% ownership by employees. And we're also looking for broad coverage amongst the employees. You don't want it isolated in a few numbers. So the figures I'm going to sort of present will give us this overall picture of how the sector is doing and how it's growing. I thought as a sort of starting point, it was just worthwhile putting this graph on there purely because it shows visually how the sector is doing. And clearly it just shows how we've sort of had pretty phenomenal performance over the last sort of 6-7 years, okay? So I'll get to the specifics. It feels a bit like the top 40 countdown that I used to listen to. I'm an economist. This is about as exciting as I get. So I'm probably not the best to really big up the numbers, but I think we've got some fairly phenomenal figures over the last year. And one of the things I'll be talking about is certainly whether this is a turning point or has been a turning point year for the sector. I think the other thing I'd just like to say when we look at these figures is the employee-owned sector is a fairly dynamic sector now. There are changes in levels of employee ownership going on. There are companies being sold. There are, unfortunately, companies going out of business. But it's getting to a scale now where it's starting to reflect, traditional sectors. It functions in all the same ways. If we just look at this graph, we can just see the phenomenal growth really since 2014. And I only just want to pick up a couple of points here. One is obviously the growth from 2014 onwards. We can just see the graph go, I wouldn't say exponentially, but it's gone upwards in a dramatic style. I think the other thing that is becoming evident, and this is more anecdotal, is that employee ownership is becoming more acceptable. When people are looking at succession strategies or exit strategies, employee ownership is out there. So I think part of this is to actually, is the roll down of practitioners and experts in the area. The message is getting out there. It is seen as a viable option. And I think that part might partly explain some of the more recent growth. I know you can't wait any longer to look at the actual figures. So Annabelle, if you go to the next slide. These are just some of the, I think, the broad measures. I won't spend a lot of time, but it's worthwhile picking out, I think, some of the headline figures. At this time last year, we were talking about the 370 employee-owned businesses. So we've now added 100 companies since this time last year. We're now at about 470. And although I like to be precise, I would say that is a conservative estimate. It comes down to the ones that we can actually identify. If we actually look at that year on year, that is, we've had nearly 100 conversions in 2019. So that accounts for a year on year growth of about 28%. As we can tell with the graphic there, we actually put the word in, that is record growth. Every year I've done this, we tend to say that the figures have got better. But this is by far, the greatest increase we've seen. And we've had, as I say, in 2019, nearly 100 more companies become employee owned. Just moving to the last one there, we can see that really a lot of the growth has happened in the last 3 to 4 years. So we're looking at over 50% of the conversions to employee ownership have occurred since 2017. So it's really impressive where the sector is at now. It's moving on year by year. Clearly, the debate is going to move on to what will happen in 2020. But if I stick to a more positive story for the moment, we can always revisit that some other time. These are, I think, phenomenal figures. I thought it might be worthwhile just to provide a short bit of evidence on sort of where the key sectors are and where the key sort of regional distribution is. I think what I would preface here is that we are seeing employee-owned companies in all sectors and in all regions. So employee ownership is suitable for all sectors. Even when we get to the regions, we're seeing that employee ownership is evident in every region. We're also seeing that it's growing in every region. So I think, again, something to be proud of for the whole sector. In what we're doing here, I've just focused on the top 5 for the sector and the industry. And within each of those, we're just looking at 2017 onwards. But these are a broad reflection of the whole sample. So these can be viewed in a number of ways. If we just look at the sector, I think this probably won't come as a surprise, but we're sort of seeing the professional services at the top. That sort of dominates. It's more than double the size of the next sector. But interestingly for me, we're seeing large presence in sort of manufacturing, information communications, construction and wholesale. And these sort of tend to dominate over time. I think if you look at the national distribution of sort of companies by sector, the 2 sectors that do stand out are the top 2, professional services and manufacturing. And probably being quite a proud Northerner, I'm proud of the manufacturing base is well presented here. And it outperforms sort of what you would expect given its profile across the whole economy. People keep asking me sort of to delve into these figures because these are just based on a standard industrial classification. And what we can delve down in quite a lot of detail to sort of a 6-digit figure. But what we're seeing in the professional services are the emergence of large clusters of employee-owned firms, where perhaps they're no longer the exception. I wouldn't say they're becoming the norm, but in certain sectors, they are the norm rather than the exception. The one that's been, I think, highlighted a lot is the architectural area, architecture and sort of scientific and related activities. We're seeing about 40% of the professional services sector is coming from that area, from architecture. The other big area is this broad category, but it's defined as management consulting. So that's another large grouping. Manufacturing is a bit more spread, but we're seeing a large cluster in the information and communication sector. And again, that's around computer programming and sort of consultancy activities. So what we're starting to see once we delve into these figures is the emergence of quite a sort of a critical mass of companies in very sort of narrow areas, which I think is exciting. It enables us, it allows us something to grow on. I'll just finish with the sector, with the regional areas. I don't think these have probably changed from last year. And looking at the figures again, where you look at where companies are based, this is probably what we'd expect, particularly with London and the South East. But actually, London exceeds what we'd expect. And I think the other one that is worthy is Scotland. It way outperforms in terms of the percentage of employee-owned firms what we would expect nationally in terms of the number of firms in Scotland. So whether we want to put that at the promotional activities and the environment in which it's promoted within Scotland, that's a possible reason. But all sectors are represented, all sectors have done well, and I think all sectors have grown all regions have grown, confusing myself. So all sectors have grown, all regions have grown in their presence. It's a really positive story. So just probably to hand over to Nigel, I think 2019 has been an incredibly positive story. There's more that we can do. I think it offers a lot of opportunities. I think from a personal view, the message I'm getting from other people, because I always want to hear what we should be looking at, is that we need to delve into these figures more. People want to know more about what's happening inside employee-owned companies. And I think as part of the White Rose Centre, that's really what our focus is going to be on over the next year. So I'll hand over to Nigel.
Great, thank you, Andrew. As Andrew said, we collaborate a lot on the analyses that we each do. Andrew covers the whole sector, all different ownership styles and types. And we focus on 2 subsets, the top 50 annual league table and an EOT survey. We collaborate on definitions of data as well as actual kind of data points. So we're applying exactly the same criteria to define employee ownership as does Andrew. If we can have the next slide, please, Annabelle. So today, as we do every year on EO Day, we publish the latest top 50 list. We've been doing this since 2014, so this is the 7th outing. I don't expect you to be able to read that small text on the screen, but you can download this graphic from both the RM2 website and the EOA website from today. And the important thing to stress here is that this is based entirely on public domain information. So we rely very heavily on records at Companies House. So this data is only as good as the filings that are made and the timeliness of those filings. And in practice, that means that most of this data relates to 2019, because obviously there's a time lag between financial year end and filing. And therefore, this is all pre-coronavirus lockdown. So, you know, obviously this data might look quite different in a year's time, we shall see. If you go on to the next slide, please. So one reason for doing this league table is that as with many kind of distributions of data, we've got quite big concentration in the top 50. In fact, they represent around 90% of total employment in the entire sector. So by analyzing the top 50, we can make estimates of the performance of the whole sector. So it's a useful kind of subset to analyze. Just as Andrew was pointing out concentrations of trade sector, there are two notable concentrations in the top 50 list. First of all, 17 of the top 50 operate in the care sector, and that's because a number of the top 50 companies were formed by the mutualization of what used to be public sector businesses. And then the other notable concentration is in what I've called the built environment, and I'm using that phrase to cover everything from construction right the way through to the professional services associated with the built environment, such as architects' practices. So that, you'll see that more than half the top 50 are concentrated in two sectors. The number of employees you need to have to qualify for inclusion this year is 378. That number changes each year. I'll come back to the point about borrowings on the next slide when we look at various performance measures. The final sort of notable point is that 13 of the top 50 are now employee ownership trusts. And I would expect that number to grow in future years, because that's where we're seeing most of the activity in the sector at the moment. It's conversions of businesses, sometimes quite big ones, into EOTs. In fact, we've got a representative from one of the top 50 on the webinar a bit later, Anne-Marie Conway from CTEC. If we go on to the next slide, please. This just highlights some of the key performance measures. You'll see that on the right-hand chart, I'm not sure you can see it, it's slightly obscured on my screen, but the combined sales of the top 50 is 20.1 billion, which is up 4.3% on a like-for-like basis with the previous year. And compare that to the growth in GDP in the UK economy, which was up only 1.2%. So certainly growth in this top 50 is greater than the economy at large. And also the total number of employees is 178,000. That's up just 1% on the previous year, which is in line with the growth in employment in the economy as a whole. Just to put the 178,000 in context, that's the same number of people as are employed in all vehicle manufacturing. So cars, buses, trains, trailers even. If you add up all the employment in those sometimes very big companies like Jaguar Land Rover, Nissan, it comes to 178,000. So, just to put a marker on how significant this cohort of companies is. Productivity, which is one of the UK's great puzzles, has been stubbornly flat in the economy as a whole for the best part of a decade. But in the top 50 cohort, it has risen consistently year on year. And we're defining productivity as value added per employee. In other words, take operating profit, add back wages, and divide by the number of employees. And that's gone up a remarkable 6.9% in the year since the last top 50 list. Whereas in the economy as a whole, it's pretty flat. And the reason this is such an important measure is because unless companies can demonstrate consistent productivity, they won't be able to pay sustained wage increases. And the employee-owned sector has paid sustained wage increases. So last year, 4.5% was the average wage increase, which is higher than the wage increase paid to employees as a whole in the economy. Finally, the number of companies with no net debt is 2/3. The proportion with no net debt is 2/3. Now, of course, that may change when we look at this this time next year, because a lot of businesses may well have taken on coronavirus-related emergency loans. But it's a measure of how prudently financed employee-owned businesses certainly were compared to businesses nationally. And hopefully that has put a lot of businesses in a strong position to withstand the current economic challenges. I'll move on to the next slide, please, Annabelle. And in view of the time, Andrew, I was just going to go straight into this, if that's okay. This is one of a number of slides from the results of the EOT survey. And what I wanted to point out here is that EOTs are most popular in companies with between 10 and 49 employees. You'll see 164 EOTs are in that size range. The numbers in red on top of each bar show the penetration of EOTs amongst private companies nationally. And it's the number per 1,000 private companies nationally. So if you look at the two right-hand bars, you'll see that in the case of 50 to 249 employees, just over 2.5 of all private companies nationally, 2.5 out of 1,000 are already EOT owned. Now, that might strike you as quite a low penetration, and I think it is. It's a measure really of how much more EOTs could get established in the next few years. So they've made a very good start, and they are contributing to most of the growth that Andrew identified. But we're starting from a very low base, and there's a lot more positive potential ahead, I believe. So I know that they were a bit pressed for time. So Deb, I'm going to finish there. I'm sorry that was a bit brisk, but we can always take questions at the end.
No, not at all. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Nigel. And thank you for all the hard work you both do in gathering that data. It's ridiculously difficult, as Andrew said, to gather the data. It shouldn't be that difficult. And, you know, really what we want is the government to assist in some of its own data collection about how we can ensure that this sector, now that it's growing at scale, is able to easily identify its characteristics without us having to necessarily rely on lots of third-party data all the time. But thank you to both of you. Really fascinating stuff, and shows that this sector is growing both in size and in diversity, and is outperforming across some serious and important issues around productivity, around wages, and around turnover. The point about no net debt is fascinating when you look at what we're facing at the moment, which is the topic we're now going to lead on to, which is about, you know, how do we build back better? So at this point, I've got a few people to welcome and introduce. So Anne-Marie Conway, who's Associate Director at CTEC, who are a new entry in the top 50. Chris McDermott, who's the Managing Director of the One-to-One Diet by Cambridge Weight Plan and a board member at the EOA. Dan Thomas, who I'm delighted is joining us from the Financial Times, and to reintroduce Ewan Hall. So if you'd like to all, if you haven't already, unmute yourselves and turn your video screens on. This is the equivalent to walking on stage and getting a round of applause, by the way. So just imagine that's happening. I know it isn't, but just imagine it is. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. And we pitched this morning's conversation around the Build Back Better agenda. It's a phrase that the United Nations coined, actually, when looking at parts of the world that were recovering from earthquakes and natural disasters. But it's clearly a phrase that's resonated across the UK as we think about what the economy might look like. So I'm going to start, first of all, I'd like to welcome Dan. And maybe we can just find out a little bit more, Dan, about who you are, what you do at the Financial Times. And then I'd just like to have a chat with you about your external perspectives of this sector, on the basis that I think many of the people on the webinar this morning are from within the sector. So they're used to hearing us talk about the sector in a positive way. But what I'm really trying to dig into in the next half an hour is what is the opportunity for employee ownership, and your impartial perspective will be really helpful.
Yeah, no, thanks, Deb, and thanks so much for inviting me today. It's really, really kind of you, and really interesting to hear all the findings that you've had from this year. Yeah, I guess I'm well, I'm effectively the UK business editor at the FT, so I cover the kind of intersect between policy and the boardroom, talking to both government and officials on one side, and you know the managers and the chief executives and so on of businesses in the UK at the moment, which is a particularly busy beat because it's obviously so much going on in terms of the fallout of coronavirus, and even looking now ahead to Brexit, which is rearing its head again. So lots around corporate governance and employee and investor stakeholdering, as well as things like, you know, how the government's approaching the bailouts of the economy at the moment. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's great to hear that there's such positive news from the sector and there's such growth. So I think the backdrop is pretty negative at the moment. As we know, it's a really difficult time for the economy. It's going to be a very tough time for businesses in the next few months and years. You know, we're facing a time when there could be millions of jobs lost potentially between now and the end of the year. There could be a prospect of a sustained recession, and that's not including, you know, any sign of a second wave of the pandemic and whatever happens with the vaccine, which everyone wants to talk about, but it's still very uncertain. You know, the government feels at the moment very focused on July the 4th, next weekend, and there's a July stimulus package coming down the tracks, which will be partly predicated on what they see as re-emerging from when people hit the shops and bars again, and whether or not normality can come back. But, you know, I don't think anyone's really expecting any sort of business normality to return until 2022 at the very earliest. And so everyone's really preparing for this new normal and whatever that turns out to be.
In terms of what you've heard this morning, and I know you and I have spoken briefly in the past about the employee-owned sector, what's your external perspective on this sector? How well do you think it is understood across the economy? And what do you think the markets and people like you make of employee ownership?
I think it's getting better understood. I think, you know, as you know, it's still relatively, you know, obviously small compared to the bigger scope of corporate Britain, but it's becoming much better known. You know, everyone knows things, obviously, like John Lewis, but Richer Sounds, I think, were also a very good example, and everyone in the press jumped on Richer Sounds very happily because it's a great story and a great example of businesses doing the right thing. And I think that's the key thing, really. I think for journalists at the moment, the media, and for, you know, and hopefully this reflects what's happening within corporate Britain, it's partly about this doing the right thing idea. I thought it was interesting in the recent round of big rights issues and equity placings in the public markets, you know, investors were increasingly saying, well, we'll give you support for you know, raising money, but you have to be seen to be doing good with it. You can't just be feathering your own nest and, you know, saving your own backsides. You know, you've got to come with some ideas about how society is going to be playing into this sort of strategy you have. And I think that's where, you know, I think employee ownership really has an advantage, because you have a chance to really talk about, you know, companies which are trying, you know, working with their employees. Indeed, their employees are their companies. So, you know, they're really sort of pushing the, you know, good corporate governance, you know, sensible business practices, and all that sort of stuff that we really like to talk about now. And I think it really feeds into a lot of what we do at the FT around moral money, as we've been calling it, but which is the larger, you know, ESG agenda. And
I know, obviously, there's a focus, and the FT has talked about this and written about this, should I say, on a new focus, or a re-emerging focus on SMEs. And you saw from the data that Nigel showed earlier that there is a popularity of employee ownership, particularly in that space. What's your view specifically on SMEs then, about where this might figure? Because I get and I understand why some of the big corporate sort of narratives don't necessarily chime or understand, therefore, employee ownership, particularly the fact that many businesses don't carry debt, which is a bit of an anathema for many larger corporates. But where do you think it figures around the SME space? Yeah, I mean, God, not having debt right now is a godsend. I mean, that's such an advantage to begin with. I mean, the flip side is a particular problem. I think coronavirus has really presented a particular problem for smaller businesses. Like I said, I think actually the response from the equity markets has been a really good advert, arguably, for the stock exchange. But, you know, the pain within the SMEs is just brutal. You know, we're getting so much incoming, you know, calls, emails, letters from people who are really struggling at the moment to survive. You can see this in the government support package. You know, some £40 billion has been put out there in government-backed loans through the banks, which is an enormous sum to be taken on by companies which are often below 50 people. But the bounce-back loan scheme, which is now about £30 billion out, is for micro businesses. They're not even SMEs, they're the smallest of the small. It's really difficult. And, you know, people are having to take on debt, you know, having to find ways to really navigate this period. And they're certainly not out of the woods yet. So if the employee ownership space is going in with low leverage,
sensible balance sheets, sensible ways to approach business. It's a huge advantage, to be honest. It'd be interesting to see, as I said earlier, what the numbers are on leverage this time next year, because I think people will have to take on support. Obviously, the lockdown, the economic lockdown around coronavirus has been absolute. You can't do business in this environment, so there have to be some sort of support. But emerging with a sensible plan, and often because of the background they've had of low leverage and good approach, they'll have their support of the banks, they'll have the support of the people who need to sign this sort of stuff off, and will guarantee hopefully their future for some time.
Brilliant, thanks Dan. I didn't want you to feel like you were under the spotlight then, with all of us watching and listening intently, but it was really interesting to get your perspective. As I say, the danger of being passionate about the topic, as everybody else on this call is that we can sometimes be in an echo chamber. So it's really important that we reach out and listen. So can I bring in, first of all, Chris? Chris, I didn't introduce you fully because I thought you could do that yourself. But once you have, I wondered if we might dig into something that Dan highlighted there, which is around the sort of doing well and doing good. So keen to sort of understand a little bit more about the business, and where does that sort of resilience piece fit really? Because doing well as a business, but doing good by everybody that the business serves. So can you expand a little bit on that after you've told us a little bit about who you are?
Sure, thanks Deb, and thanks for inviting me today. Chris McDermott, the Managing Director of the One-to-One Diet by Cambridge Weight Plan. We're a very low calorie diet food manufacturing business based in Corby in Northamptonshire. We're currently the EOA's Business of the Year, so we wear that badge very proudly, having won the award in November. And we both a food manufacturing business, but also a direct sales company. So we sell our products through a network of independent business owners around the UK and into 30 countries around the world. We have 7,000 consultants in the UK. This idea of doing good and doing well and prospering, they're really kind of fundamental to our business, in as much as we are a business that must be run like a normal company. And certainly the last 2 or 3 months have really tested our ability to manage both the welfare of everybody, but also the survivability of the company. And so we've drawn upon a lot of the things that we talk about in employee ownership, but we've actually had to do very, very strongly in the last couple of months. And our piece really is about empowerment. So we are in trying as best as we can to empower our stakeholders. They're our employees in the company. There's 244 of them. So we empower them as much as we can. On EO Day today, just 5 minutes ago, we announced that we were paying our annual stakeholder dividend to everybody across the company of £2,500. So that's a kind of financial empowerment, but also because of the nature of the business that we're in. So we make diet products. We sell them to lots and lots of small businesses who then sell them to consumers. There's a lot of empowerment work there as well. And I think the last 3 months or so for us certainly have absolutely demonstrated the true value of employee ownership. So there was lots of things you can say about employee ownership, and there's lots of platitudes that you can have. But when it comes to the absolute crunch, when it comes to, for us in April, sales falling by 50–60%, that's when you see the value of all the work that you've put in, all of the communication, all of the information, all of the dialogue, all of the trust that you don't even know that's been built up. That's when it starts to pay for itself. And we've experienced that over the last couple of weeks, last couple of months, so much so that we're now in a position where we've gone from we're going through 3 phases of the pandemic. The first one we called resilience, which was essentially crisis. And we came out of resilience about 2 weeks ago, and we've called what we're into a phase now called rebound. And then rebound eventually will lead to recovery and a much stronger 5-year strategy. But we got to get into rebounding, to get to recovery, you have to have that resilience piece. And I'm sure there are loads and loads of businesses that aren't employee owned that have also been able to be resilient during this time. But we certainly have benefited immeasurably from this sense of we really are all in this together. And when it you know, you can say it at a conference and you can have big lights and stuff, but when it actually comes down to it, when you really are staring at financial oblivion, that's when it really counts and when it's really important.
And it's interesting that we were reflecting earlier on before the webinar started about the need to possibly look at getting some new data together about that resilience. So, you know, as we come out of this year, possibly into early next year, we may well look to try and capture some new statistics and some new evidence about that resilience. So you talked about trust there, Chris. Again, there's been, during this pandemic so far, there's been certain corporate behaviours of certain companies that have hit the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And, you know, people have said that, you know, reputations have been made during the crisis. I think I challenge that by saying actually reputations have been revealed rather than made, and that, you know, that reputation was always there. And I just wonder, a lot of it's been centred around trust. It's been trust with the public, it's been trust with employees, it's been trust with suppliers. How do you think a business like yours has been able to generate that trust? What specifically have you done to do that?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this since you invited me onto the webinar, because trust is such an interesting word, and it really is. We have been able to benefit from it, not because of the trust that we have built up this week. It's the trust that we started building up years ago that we didn't really know we were doing. We just kind of embraced employee ownership. We became 100% employee owned in 2015, and there's a kind of DNA within the company that we should do and behave in a certain way, and we should act in a certain way, and we should speak in a certain way, and we should communicate very, very openly with people. And I didn't see that as we've got to build loads of trust up because at some point in the future we're going to need to use it. It was just the way of running the business, and what we thought and what we think is the right way of running the business. It's only now almost that we're through this kind of first resilience phase that I see and understand and appreciate that actually when it came to the crunch and we had to make super fast decisions about all sorts of things that would have taken us honestly years to do in the other world, there was the trust. We built up this trust that people thought, yeah, these guys know what they're doing. They know they've got our backs. They know what they're doing is for the good of everybody. Let them get on with it. Don't stand in the way. We trust them to do it. And that trust was not built on the first day of the pandemic. And if you think it is going to be, you're in big trouble. It's built over years and years worth of trying to do the right thing. And sometimes trying to do the right thing is running a business like a proper normal business. But it's all the stuff around it that doesn't take a lot of effort really, but actually you can't imagine how much it's generating until you come to the wall and then you understand it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Anne-Marie, can I invite you into the conversation? Again, say a few words about who you are. I won't try and do that for you, but as a newbie to the sector, I guess it'd be interesting to reflect on some of those same topics. Particularly about the inequality piece, because obviously structurally as a business you're very much providing services in a space which is about equality, but really keen to understand, because I know you've had a special event this week take place which partly speaks into that agenda of inequality, or equality should I say, a voice within the business. So do you want to say a little bit about your move to employee ownership?
Yeah, thanks, Deb, and thanks for inviting me today. This is our first Employee Ownership Day, so it's really great to be celebrating it with you. So I work for CTEC Group, and CTEC works with people and communities to create a fairer society, and that's in the justice and in the skills and in the employment space. So the people we would work with would typically already be on some of those margins, either through their offending background, through long-term unemployment, through low skill. So we very much work in that space already. And therefore, being employee owned and having our people who know that client and know that customer group better than anyone else, working with them and having their voice reflected in the heart of our organisation for us is really exciting, because they work day in, day out with that client group and would be very familiar with the issues that they face, both at an individual and at a community level. So we are acutely aware of some of the challenges that these marginalised groups are going to be facing. They were marginalised prior to the pandemic, and so therefore the impact on those particular groups is going to be huge. It's going to be significant as we ease out of this. I'm struck by what Chris said just there about building trust in organisations. We made a decision when we became employee owned back at the beginning of the year, back in January, which seems like such a long time ago. It feels like a lifetime ago now with everything that's happened. But we made a decision actively to take our time to reach the point of getting to our first employee council, which is actually happening today, straight after this meeting. And that was because we wanted to build trust, and we wanted to build that engagement with our people, our employee owners. And we felt that it was worth putting the work in over the first few months to really build that engagement and really build that trust. CTEC is a very values-led business. We don't build or manufacture. Our business is only as good as the people we employ and the work they do with individuals and communities. So the values were strong in the business anyway, and therefore a step to employee ownership, which was the right thing for our majority shareholder, was certainly the right thing for our business. And already, although it's very early days for us, we are already seeing the benefits of that trust that Chris, you were just mentioning, and the quality and the standard of debate we've had around leading up to our elections, our campaigning. The response from people has been actually quite overwhelming. People have really grasped and are excited and enthused by becoming employee owners. And we are really looking forward to celebrating our first employee council later today. But I just echo what Chris said about trust. It's a gradual process and it builds. So.
And I mean, you're talking about a relatively new business that's become employer, but are you able to give us any examples of, anecdotally, some of the things that have happened that maybe wouldn't have happened before you became employer that might bring that to life?
Yeah, so I think a good example is a good proportion of our business is in the justice space, where we contract with the Ministry of Justice for probation services, and we do that across Wales, the southwest and the southeast of the country. So just recently, you might be aware that the government made an announcement to renationalise all of that activity in 2021, which was unexpected. I mean, there were changes to the contract planned, but the change to bring it all back to the National Probation Service was unexpected. So that's a huge level of change for the people who work with us in probation. And they've seen a lot of change over the last few years, from the original privatisation of that sector to some changes of ownership. We certainly inherited some additional probation service business last year. So, for them to face another huge change and to be renationalised, it was interesting, therefore, to hear their responses. They were very much speaking up for CTEC, very much speaking up for employee ownership, and unexpected given the sector they work in, which is probation, and where they'd originally started with, which was public sector, but very much speaking up in our favour and feeling very strongly about being an employee-owned business, and the disappointment for many of them about having to leave that behind.
No, it's fascinating. It's that empowerment, the power of ownership that gives voice to people.
Absolutely, and as I say, we're at the early stages of that. So we've a lot of talk and rhetoric around employee ownership. We've got to deliver a lot of those benefits now, but we've been really impressed with the standard and the quality of debate and the engagement of our people. We've had some fantastic election activity. We've had a really big turnout in many of our business pillars for the election, and this week we've done a number of activities to celebrate Employee Ownership Week, and that's been great to see.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Ewan, can I bring you back in? Obviously, I know you spend most of your working hours when you're not running around after small people, helping small businesses and helping them transition, helping them get themselves fit and ready for employee ownership. I was struck by Dan's comment earlier, reflecting on the sort of the low levels of debt that is a godsend, I think he said, that the top 50 shows that there's a high level of lack of debt within the sector. And SMEs, of course, are going to be really important in the recovery. So just keen to get your reflections on, you know, some of the if you collect all of your clients together in a big room and try to describe them in 5 key characteristics as SMEs, what would you typically be seeing in those businesses that are different from another group of non-EO businesses at that same sort of scale?
Sure. I mean, I'd probably echo something of what Chris was saying, as in you get good examples of non-EO businesses as you do EO businesses. So we're talking a little bit at this stage about, I suppose, anecdotes and what you see, but I think it's quite interesting that what we take for granted to a certain extent within the sector about certain behaviour and good behaviour and certain good practices is perhaps not always the expectation elsewhere. And part of that is a conservative approach to debt, as Dan highlighted, which is really about building for the long term. It's not just about what's the maximum amount of profit we'll make this year, how do we make sure this business is sustainable. I think that the fact that businesses that are employee-owned, they very much care about transparency and communication, which has been a critical factor in the current crisis. How do we communicate with people? How do we keep them on board? How do we let them know what's going on? And EO businesses have often had a bit of a head start there. I think that fairness that is often there, and it's interesting what Anne-Marie said at the beginning of the journey, but you often find a lot of businesses that go down this path have got a head start there, because one of the reasons they choose employee ownership is a lot of those values are actually present to some extent already. But that fairness means that a lot of the tough decisions that have had to be made over the last few weeks and months are easier to make because no one feels that people are playing an agenda, and I'm not saying there aren't tensions. I mean, this is tough. People on furlough are worried about their job. People who aren't on furlough are saying, why are they getting paid the same as me? Well, I'm out here sort of keeping the business alive, and there's tensions there. But you get to fast track your way past a lot of those tensions that exist otherwise in other businesses. And we saw a test run of this to a certain extent in 2008, 2009, where you saw EO businesses often come through with more resilience, built for the long term. They're still commercial organizations, and you know they can hit the wall like other businesses, but on average they came through better. And while it's still early days, I think that's the direction of travel we're probably seeing here as well. But we'll see how that unfolds as well over the next few weeks and months, particularly as the furlough unwinds. But at the moment, the businesses, and it's not just about dealing with the crisis, actually being creative about thinking about the next step. The world has not stopped. We still need to have an organization that functions. And that is very much you're seeing the creativity that's going on in the sector. And I'm talking about clients, but also ourselves. I've never been prouder of our partners in terms of how they've responded and the creativity and effort they put in. It's been really inspiring.
Yeah. And it will be, the response you described from 2008, it'll be interesting when we have the opportunity to track what's happened during this period, if you see a replication of that. Because anecdotally, I think, as you say, Ewan, there are lots of examples where we're hearing that EO businesses seem to be doing the right thing with their people. And there are probably lots of non-EO businesses that are doing the right thing, as we all accept. But it's whether or not proportionally, actually, we can demonstrate that the sector has been more resilient. Dan, are you still there? Are you still with us? I think you probably are. Yeah. Hi. So we've only got a couple of minutes really left, and I'd just be really interested again, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to, because you're the outsider here to the sector, and you're always going to offer the sort of, honest broker view. So what you've just heard is the sector's growing, you've seen the numbers, it looks like it's performing very strongly, we've got the evidence. Anecdotally, through businesses like Chris's and Anne-Marie's and the various ones that you engages with, we can provide loads of case studies, we can demonstrate this. But what we've always as a sector acknowledged is, I've often described us as we're a minority sport. There's a few of us who like doing it on a Saturday morning. It's a bit like a closed user group, and we all get passionate and wear the t-shirt. But actually, the big boys are not noticing us. What would your tips be as an expert in this field? You've seen every type of business. You've written about every type of business. What do you think we should be doing as a sector to get noticed?
I think it is, a lot of what has been spoken today is what we do care about, to be honest. I think really interesting case studies and really interesting examples of corporate good practice, and often employee-owned companies have really interesting characters that can bring their stories to life in ways which we really care about. I think there is a bigger focus now on privately held and privately owned companies anyway. I think there is, given the crisis, and like I say, what will need to happen. So as with all things, it's all about the story, really. It's all about telling really compelling, really interesting, character-filled stories about how companies are doing good things in ways that perhaps might surprise others. But we love all these stories. I mean, I was down in Poole seeing Lush before Christmas. Lovely story around that as a retailer. They have a little bit of employee ownership there, not total, still majority owned by their founders, but nonetheless they're moving towards that direction. And it's just a nice story about a company doing extremely well, a British company at a time when things are so uncertain, doing some really good things and trying to do good for their employees and for the wider society as a result. It's a bit of both, isn't it? It's a bit of do well financially, do well for your people. It's going to be a period now of like a lot of hard graft, long hours and short pay. Everyone's going to be quite stressed, I feel, and so companies who are doing right by their people is going to be really, really important. I think there's some really difficult decisions to be made as well. So I think that's the other thing to be clear about, is in how and it feels like the employer-owned companies can communicate that better. And if to the point that Chris was making, if they can move faster, that's also a real advantage. But in terms of getting in the press, I think it's always just about stories. We like strong, interesting characters. I'm trying to think of the things we've done recently. I've done things around companies like John Smedley and Hawksmoor, the restaurant chain, and just the things that bring the story to life, really. And that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think obviously the media have got a massive role to play for the sector, because all the while that we are still a distant cousin, if you like, to the wider economy, and we're much smaller. The minute Dan Thomas in the FT writes a story about Riverford Organics or about Richer Sounds or about Lush or Ardman or any other of the big names, what we find is it suddenly raises awareness. And for an institution like the Financial Times, it brings with it the credibility, because they know you've done your due diligence and you've got the integrity behind the story. So massively important. Our obvious other big challenge is getting into government, and as part of the economic recovery strategy and planning that's going on, not just in UK government, but in Scottish government and Welsh Assembly government, where employee ownership has got its own mechanisms of support, hence the popularity of employee ownership in Scotland. I think for us there's also that challenge. I'm sure employee ownership can be part of Build Back Better, and it'll be people like Chris and Anne-Marie and Ewan and Nigel and Andrew who are going to help us do that, and all of the people who are watching. So thank you to all of you for taking part today, taking an hour out of your day to watch and to be involved. I think I've been really pleasantly surprised that, yet again, we've been able to bring to life some of the stories of employee ownership at a time when we clearly do need to redesign and rebuild the economy. The pandemic has revealed the problems that are inherent in the current model of capitalism, particularly inequality and lack of resilience. Those faults were already there. The pandemic hasn't created them. And yet here we've got a sector where, as Chris described it, embedded in the DNA of the sector is resilience and is equality and fairness that Ewan talked about, and the long-term approach and the empowerment. So actually it's our challenge now as a sector. The EOA will take a leading role in this, of course, but it's for all of us who represent the sector to make sure that our voice is heard in that recovery planning. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Dan, to Anne-Marie, Ewan, Chris, Nigel and Andrew. Please take a moment at the end. We will send you a survey to check, is there any topics and things that you would like us to cover in the future. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer the 2 or 3 questions, but we will pick those up. We know who you are, and we will come back to you and see if we can give you some support in that. And obviously you can follow us in all the usual ways via our Twitter feeds and our Facebook feed and our LinkedIn feed. Thank you once again to Baxendale for their support of EO Day. We're only halfway through the day. There's lots more cake to be eaten. There's lots more tweets to be tweeted. And at 1 o'clock, if you've got the energy, it is the first ever EO is the answer big quiz, which I'm promised by the team is going to be something not to miss. I don't even know if there's a prize at the end of this. I suspect there isn't. It's just the honour and the kudos of winning. So please do take part. We do like to have some fun as well as be serious on EO Day. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of EO Day, and we'll see you at the other side.